Hey YouTubers, it's Audra from the Kurt's Corner. Welcome back to my channel. So during the Christmas holiday, I decided that I wanted to make my mom a handmade gift. It's something that I often do for people that I love. And I made her this puff quilt. It was something that I had never tried making before. I had just seen one on Pinterest and decided that I wanted to make one. It didn't have a tutorial, I just saw a picture. So I kind of just slapped together one based off of what I thought would be a good tutorial, and I got really great feedback on my Instagram channel about the quilt. Everybody was asking how I had made the puff quilt and if I was going to be doing a tutorial, so because you asked for it, I made it. And today I'm going to be showing you how to make a smaller version. So the original version that I made was a very large size quilt. So one that would be for maybe an adult size, so it would cover your whole body. But today I decided to do a tutorial for a smaller version. This one is going to be basically like a lap quilt or something that you can use for a child. So this could either be used for a child's crib, or you could use it for a play mat on the floor. I use it for my son's playtime on the floor. You could use it for tummy time for a kid, or for them for a blanket to watch cartoons or TV shows. So this quilt, this is what it looks like. Step back. So it is a square quilt, and it is 64 puffs by 64 puffs. And when I say puff, I'm referring to these little puffs that are here. So in total, the quilt comes out to 32 inches by 32 inches. So the puffs that I'm going to start with, they're going to be about 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and then the backing to those puffs are going to be 5 by 5. So you're going to cut out a total of 128 squares to do this. You're going to cut out 4 side pieces that you're going to see here, and then you're going to cut out a back side, which is going to be 32 by 32. You'll actually want to cut it, giving it a little seam allowance, so you might want to cut it to a 34 by 34. That way you can cut off additional pieces or inches around it so that it ends up being the right size. Always give yourself a little extra fabric when doing this project, so that you don't, end up with a smaller quilt than you had planned. So let's go ahead and get started. To prepare for this project, you will need to cut out a total of 128 pieces of fabric. 64 pieces of fabric are going to be the pattern pieces of fabric, which are the front of our puffs, and 64 will be the plain white backings, which will be for the back of our puffs. So the pattern pieces will be 5 by 5 inches, and the white backings will be 4 inches by 4 inches, for a total of 128 puffs. Now that we've completed our first step, which was to cut out all of our squares, we're going to go ahead and start making our puffs. So I think cutting out the squares is probably what takes the longest. So the next part you'll get to do a little bit faster. You'll see your work coming along. So this is what the puffs look like when they're finished. So here's one of the colors that I have for the puffs, and then here's another design. So they kind of look like little ravioli puffs to me, sort of. But you just want to make sure that when you make them, you don't overstuff them, because you don't want them to be too hard, because you won't be able to sew them together, because you're going to have to push them together when you sew down the edge. So just remember that when you're stuffing them. So the first step to making them, after you've cut out your fabric, is assembling them. So I have my 5 inch by 5 inch square, and then I have my 4 inch by 4 inch, which is just the backing, which you won't see on our puffs when we're finished. So the first step is to match up one of the corners of your fabric, and the pretty side will be facing up. So I'm going to put that on my sewing machine, and I'm going to put in about 1/4 of an inch, give it a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance so that I can be able to sew them later. You don't want it to be too big, because then you lose the size of your puff, and you don't want them to be too small, because you won't be able to sew them together as easily if it's too small. So put in about 1/4 of an inch, and all you have to do is make a straight, simple seam, and you also need to add in your pleats. You can pin these pleats in if you want. I think that takes twice as long, if not more. It's just as easy to do it by hand. So all I'm doing is I'm taking the opposite end and matching that as well to the other corner of the 4x4, and then creating this, basically this little hump in the fabric and folding it over in the middle so that I create a pleat. So I'm going to put in the first seam. Turn our work, and then again match up the corner here so that you create that hump in your fabric and put in another pleat. Okay, turn one last time and make sure that you are, again, matching up the corner, and you're going to want to match the pleat on the other side. So if you folded it going this way on that other side, make sure you match it up. So I'm going to fold it the opposite way so that it lines up with the pleat on the other side. So now I'm going to put in this last seam. And I'm going to cut the threads now, and now I have an open puff. So the next step, so I have 3 sides that are sewn together and 3 pleats and 1 open end. So now I'm going to take my polyfill, which is polyester fiber fill, which is really soft, and I'm going to take a good fair amount and stuff that inside my puff. So again, just be sure that you're not overfilling them because they'll be too puffy. They won't be as pliable when you're trying to sew them together, but make sure that you put enough in there so that it has a nice puff finish. So I'm going to put that back on my sewing machine, again, making sure that the pleats match up in the direction that they're going, and put in one last seam. So after you've made a few of these, you'll get really fast at making them. This is only my second puff quilt, but I definitely feel like I've gotten it done a lot quicker than my first one. First one took me about 2 weeks to make, but it was also during the holidays, and I also have a 1-year-old, so nap time is my only craft time. But here is the puff, and you can see that it has a good dome puff shape and about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on each side. So you're going to go ahead and make all 64 of your puffs to make the child size quilt, and then we'll go ahead and start creating our pattern and sewing them together. Okay, now that we have our puff design laid out into place, it's time to go ahead and start sewing our puffs together, and we're going to sew them together in rows first, and then we're going to sew them together as a whole to make the square. So I've already gone ahead and sewn one together, and all I did was I placed one on top of the other and smushed them down so that I could get the seam allowance under the pedal, or under the foot. And what's really important here is that you make sure that you sew on the opposite side of the first initial seam that you put in. So here is the initial seam that we put in. So we're going to sew to the left of that if you're putting it under this direction. And that's so that the seam doesn't show once you have your puffs together. So you can see here that you can't see the initial seams when we put them in the first time. So that'll just keep our quilt nice and pretty. So just make sure you sew to the left of that. So I put 2 together. So the next one is this one in my pattern, just making sure. So what I'm going to do is do the same thing, and I'm going to lay this one on top of this puff, and then I'm going to put it under, put my pedal, my foot down, and then again put in another straight stitch to the left of the initial seam that I put in. Okay, so all you're going to do is continue to put in or put together your pattern that you've laid out on the floor until you have all of your rows completed, and then we're going to sew them together. All right, so this is what 2 rows look like once they're completed. So it's just a little line of our cute little puffs. So what I'm going to do is follow my pattern and make sure that I'm keeping it correct with my diagonal pattern. So I'm going to do the same thing with what I was doing with the individual puffs, but I'm going to lay them down on top of one another and put in my straight seam. So again, going to the left of the initial stitch or the initial seam that we put in. And this time when you're doing it, you want to make sure that your lines are matching up. Otherwise, you're going to have your puffs not matching up in the pattern and they won't look as neat. So when you're doing that, just try to make sure that the seam from this side matches up with the seam from the other side. Okay, so that was pretty easy. You might have to do a little bit of repositioning when you sew the rows together and a little bit of guiding. I have a walking foot that I have, but I'm not using it because the puffs are so thick that it's hard to get the fabric and the puffs under the walking foot, which helps guide the fabric through. So I'm just using just a regular foot. So that's why you saw me kind of guiding and kind of, pulling it through as it went to make sure that it stayed on track. So you'll see that all of the puffs line up. And that's what I was trying to do. So I kind of got off a little bit here. They didn't come to a perfect point. But for the most part, you can't really, notice. Like right there, that's perfect. All 4 points came together. So that's the goal, is to make sure that all of your points come together so that you have a nice pretty pattern and you can see that diagonal pattern when you finish. So that was my first set. So I'm going to finish sewing all of the 8 rows together until I have my big 8x8 square, which is 64 puffs in total. For the next step of our project, we're going to attach the front side to our puff quilt. So what I have done already is I've cut my edge pieces, my border pieces that are going to go around the quilt. So you're going to cut them to the width of 36 inches or however wide you decide to make your puff quilt. And then I made them about 7 inches wide. So I did 7 inches to give it enough length to reach the edge of the quilt or the back of the quilt, but also to give myself a seam allowance so that I could attach it here and then to the edge. So what I've done is I have pinned it to the edge of my quilt. So I put the pretty side facing down onto the puffs, and then I've pinned down the edge. And you're just going to put a simple straight stitch in that, and then when you're done doing that, it'll look like this. So when you fold it over, there's a nice clean border between the border of your quilt and then your puffs. So you're going to do that for all 4 sides, and then when you're done, we'll trim those down and make it so that it will fit around your quilt. Okay, now that we have all 4 of our sides sewn onto the main part of our puff quilt section, what I'm going to do now is cut down 2 of the parallel sides. So you'll see here that I have overlapping fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut straight here so that it matches up with this piece of fabric, and then I'm going to sew them together. That way I have one solid long piece on this end and then also parallel on the other end, and these other 2 sides are going to be the shorter sides that are going to be cut. Alright, to cut these pieces, I am going to fold this back first, but I'm also going to make sure that when I cut it, I leave enough extra fabric so that there's enough to attach it and to join it to this piece. So when I sew it, I'm going to turn it like this and sew them together so that when I flip it, I have a nice pretty seam. But just leave enough so that you can join the 2 pieces together. You can always trim it later. So I'm just going to leave just a little extra. Always leave more than you think is enough, because you can only cut once. So do that for now. The bottom section, on that same strip, cut the same one. Luckily, my fabric has ridges, so it's pretty easy to cut straight line. So again, do that now on the parallel opposite side, and we'll go ahead and join them together. Now that I've sewn all 4 of my edges together, I have also added the backing. So just simply add the backing so that the pretty side is facing out, and then we're going to go ahead and add our borders to our quilt. So all I did here was I took strips of fabric that were remains from the puffs, and I trimmed them to match the length of the puff quilt, and then I made them about 2 to 3 inches wide. So I'm going to face those down on the front side of my quilt with the pretty side facing down against the front of the quilt, and I'm just going to put in a simple seam. So I'm just going to do that for all 4 sides. You can do one at a time, it's up to you. And then once I finished adding in that seam, I'm simply going to flip the quilt over, and I'm going to fold this border under twice so that there is a pretty edge and that you won't see the raw edge of the fabric. So you can see here that I've sewn it to the front of the quilt, and when I flip it over, I'm going to take it and I'm going to fold it over twice so that the raw edge is going to be completely under the other edge, and it's going to leave a pretty seam on the back. And then I'm simply just going to put that in and sew it down in a straight seam. And you can pin this if you want, or you can just do it with your fingers as you go. You can see here that I'm just doing it with my fingers. And once you have sewn in all 4 borders onto your quilt edge, you will be done with your quilt. Thanks for watching, guys, and if you enjoyed today's tutorial, be sure to give it a big thumbs up down below. I will put instructions and dimensions and sizes all in the video description down below, and I hope you enjoy your cuddly puff quilt. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them below. This, was designed for people that are beginners with sewing, so if you don't know a whole lot, I'm happy to answer any questions. Just leave them down in the comments, and until next time, keep crafting, and I'll see you later. Bye!